Hi, everybody. This is Blaine DeSantis, and I welcome you to another edition of Books and Looks. Yes, it's our weekly voyage of discovery into the wonderful world of books. History, mysteries, fiction, and nonfiction. It's the books that I've been reading. And you add to that exclusive interviews with the authors of those books. It's all here on Books and Looks. And not only that, we want to say another big shout out to our friends at booktrib.com. If you are interested in any sort of books, book reviews, on all sorts of subjects, any day of the week, new stuff, old stuff. It's all there. You do not want to miss it. So when you think of anything bookish, you want to think of Books and Looks, and you want to think of booktrib.com. Now, in 1925, a small Tennessee town put evolution on trial. It pitted two of America's greatest orators, Clarence Darrow and William Jennings Bryan. They had a fierce duel of ideas. And this week, Debbie Levy is here and tells us about her captivating new book, which takes you inside the infamous Scopes monkey trial. This riveted the nation. It traces the roots of the battle between science and religion, and it still rages today. This book is impeccably researched. It is impossible to put down. I gave this a 5-star rating. The book, A Dangerous Idea, shows us the issues that are at the heart of the Scopes trial and which continues to shape our politics, our schools, and our beliefs even today. I'm Blaine DeSantis. This is Books and Looks. And today we're interviewing Debbie Levy on her new book, A Dangerous Idea. Debbie Levy, welcome to Books and Looks.
Thank you, Blaine. I'm happy to be here with you.
Well, I'm so very happy to have you. Your book, A Dangerous Idea, just, I'll tell you what, blew me away and taught me so much. I thank you for that.
Thanks for reading it.
Now, this book is about what we refer to as the Scopes monkey trial, but there are a lot of people out there who are not familiar with the Scopes monkey trial. So, in a short bit, tell us about where was it, when was it, what happened, John Scopes, who is this guy? Tell us a little bit of background.
Okay. So, to refresh the memory of anyone who can't quite remember what the so called Scopes monkey trial was, it was the criminal prosecution in 1925 of a teacher in Tennessee, John Scopes, for the newly created state crime of teaching the subject of evolution. This was so well known in its day, and it was made famous, if inaccurately, to later generations through the Broadway play and the movie Inherit the Wind, which, if anybody listening is a theater geek, you will also know that it's been a mainstay of high school drama departments and community theaters. To set the stage just a bit, Blaine, by 1900, the fact of evolution was uncontroversial scientific knowledge. But suddenly it became, to many people, a devilish and ungodly thing, a dangerous idea, as my title says, because it was one thing for evolution to be something that few ordinary people paid attention to. But see, at around the same time, around 1900, coming into the 20th century, we had the invention of the public high school, a very good thing. But once there was public high schools, there was biology class. And when biology class, biology textbook, and remember I said it was uncontroversial knowledge, so there were segments about Darwin's theory of evolution. Children would be reading and hearing about evolution. And when it came to exposing teenagers in high school to the science of evolution, that's when a whole lot of adults evolved into exceptionally agitated organism. And that's the story that I tell in my book.
Right. Okay. And John Scopes is in effect, a not a substitute, but he was called in to teach this class, if I'm not mistaken, because their regular teacher was not around.
Well, Scopes was a first-year teacher, and you're right. I mean, he was mostly a football coach, and he taught some other things, and the regular teacher got sick and was out for the semester. So he was sort of accidental.
The other thing, and again, to set this scene, you have to understand, friends out there, you have to understand the textbook that he taught from was a state-mandated textbook, which had the theory of evolution in it. Okay, and he was told you got to teach the textbook.
Blaine is right, people.
See? Aha. I've been telling people that for years. Thank God Debbie Levy knew it. But the other thing that they realized is that this theory of evolution, I don't even took a whole page. It was a very simple something that's in there, and they got blown up out of proportion. Correct?
Well, yes, it was. It took up parts of 4 pages in the book, so not very much. And you can't say it did a great job of conveying what evolution was. And but it didn't matter. It was just the fact that evolution was in this state mandated textbook. John Scopes was the biology teacher. He, exposed the children to this, although in truth, he couldn't quite remember if he actually taught it. So that was all very fuzzy. But, not too fuzzy for this case to go forward.
That's right. Wow, that's something, I'll tell you. Well, anyway, so we set the stage, and we have this book, A Dangerous Idea, which talks about the theory of evolution being taught in the classroom. And now, how does this relate, though, to current day, to modern day science textbooks and what's being taught? You see a correlation here?
Well, sure. I wish I didn't, but the the danger that was felt then and now, I think, is so I'm going to sort of quote Clarence Darrow, who was John Scopes's lead defense lawyer in the trial, who said something like, "Strange how anxious the old folks are apt to be over the children." And what he meant back in 1925 is that old folks, thought that there was a danger there, that they needed to design, that they needed to shield young people from information that made them, the parents, the older folks, uncomfortable, because mostly because the information might prompt those young people to embrace ideas that their parents didn't like, or maybe that the parents just didn't understand. So back in 1925, well, if I can just add this, back in 1925, the legislator in Tennessee who wrote and introduced this law, he said during the trial, he actually didn't know the first thing about evolution. All he knew is that mothers were saying that their children were coming home from school and saying that they didn't believe their Bibles anymore. Um, and today, so I think it's a similar fear that adults have over what their children might learn in school that the adults are uncomfortable with. That's, for example, what is the danger in teaching about climate change? Well, which is sort of the big, I don't know, evolution of the day in terms of anxiety over children learning about it. Well, the science suggests that beings should change their behaviors. The science shows the harms caused by burning fossil fuels, and in some quarters, that those are dangerous ideas. Now, Blaine, I don't think there is not a ban in any state on teaching climate change. But, history shows us that anti science activists can be clever. Um, uh, so, once it took many years for anti evolution laws to come to the Supreme Court. John Scopes' case didn't go to the Supreme Court, but once it did, the Supreme Court said, no, you can't forbid the teaching of evolution. It violates the First Amendment's Establishment Clause, which says there shall be no state establishment of religion. Well, then the anti evolutionists, the biblical literalists, and fundamentalists tried to get around that by kind of rebranding what they were doing. No, we're not saying you should teach creationism in science class. We're saying you should teach creation science in science class. And then when that failed, then, well, there should be equal time in science class for teaching creationism and evolution. In science class, you understand, because the problem, I can't imagine there's a problem teaching Bible stories and the creation stories in religion class, even in literature class, but when we are talking about teaching in science class. And today, I'll just add one more thing. It's not this notion of dangerous things that our children should not be exposed to, it's not limited at all to science. And I wonder, I mean, for me, what I think about a lot is this movement by some to limit the type of history we teach. That is to teach what some would call only patriotic history and what I would call, and others would call too, whitewashed history. There's a fear. I mean, the governor of Florida, said, children are going to hate their country and themselves if they learn about the truth of, the Jim Crow era or other things about systemic racism in the United States. Well, to me, it's an echo from the time of the Scopes
Hmm.
trial.
Hmm. Okay. Very good. All right. Now, you'd mentioned him. We have two major people here. We have Clarence Darrow and we got William Jennings Bryan. Now, you go in much detail about their backgrounds. Was there anything that surprised you when you were doing the research on these two great orators of America?
I was surprised at first how very popular and influential William Jennings Bryan was in his day. Um, just to make clear, so listeners know, William Jennings Bryan was sort of the marquee prosecutor in the case. That is, he hadn't been in a courtroom in decades, but he was the leading anti-evolution voice of of the day, of his generation. Um, and how did he get so popular? He had a tremendous following, and he cultivated it through speaking engagements, sometimes to vast audiences. But so I started out surprised, but the more I read his speeches and about him, the less surprised I was because I could see how he brought his audiences along with emotion, with feeling, as well as with entertainment. There's nothing like an orator, a demagogue, uh, who can make you laugh, who can really hold your attention. So when he says stuff like, how can teachers tell students that they came from monkeys and not expect them to act like monkeys? It's one of his standard lines in his anti evolution speeches. Well, his audiences ate them up. It doesn't matter that evolution doesn't say that people come from monkeys. What a great line, right? So he founded a newspaper, he wrote a column, ran for president 3 times. It is as if he created his own social media platform. So I you asked what surprised me. It first surprised me. I guess it continued to surprise me, but I better understood how he got so popular. Um, and one more surprise that I'll mention, if we're talking about Darrow and Bryan, and that is that Darrow had been spoiling for this fight with William Jennings Bryan for years. So the case was manufactured both by the town leaders of this small town in Tennessee, Dayton, and by the ACLU. But the ACLU um, didn't want Clarence Darrow, who was the leading courtroom lawyer of the day. They didn't want him on the case. They just wanted something more staid, and they knew that Darrow was after Bryan on the question of creationism versus evolution. They knew he'd been after him, but Darrow pretty much elbowed his way into the trial. And so I was surprised that he wasn't called into the trial because he's such a great lawyer. But then I understood that it was political.
Yeah. Let me tell you, not about Darrow or Bryan, but the thing that surprised me the most about the book is the
What?
lawyer who didn't take his coat off the whole time. It's stinking hot. It's hot. The judge takes his coat off. Said, take your coats and ties off. This one lawyer stays with his coat on the entire time. Oh my God. I've been stuck in air conditioned rooms with my coat on as a lawyer and I couldn't take it. So that,
So
that cracked me up.
that was Dudley Field Malone, and he was also on the defense team. And but what he did with that blame was really kind of brilliant because it's true. He was buttoned up. It was unbelievably hot. there's no air conditioning, there's barely any fans, unbelievably hot. The courtroom is mobbed. And he says he keeps this, I believe it was wool suit coat on until his big moment came to make a speech in defense of teachers and in defense of really of teenagers and trusting them and saying that we adults haven't done, remember, they're coming out of the First World War, we haven't done the greatest job. And when it is his turn to speak, he stands up, he finally takes that jacket off, folds it up, puts it on counsel table. And I mean, all of the news reports say it was as if he called the room to attention.
Right.
So I'm a great admirer of
Yeah.
this guy who somehow
That was
kept his
something else.
cool.
That
Yes.
was something else. The other thing you bring out here very, very well, I thought, is the role of the newspapers in making this trial even greater than what it was. We had H.L. Mencken, who came from, I think, the Baltimore newspapers, and we had a young lady, what was her name here? Nellie Kenyon. She
You are
came from,
good, Blaine. Nellie Kenyon from
Nellie
Tennessee. She
Kenyon,
was local. Yeah.
right. And so these two were some of the leading news people. Every day they're feeding out more and more and more stories. How do you think this actually hyped the story, made it bigger than what it really was?
Well, first, I'll just say that I loved researching and writing about the media in this story. Um, and I mean, the country, really the world was just inundated with coverage. And it's easier than ever now to dig into newsprint archives. And so I did. And what I found there was, um, they say that newspapers are the first drafts of history. And yes, with all the ambiguities and missteps and errors that first drafts have. So you have to read a lot to get what seems to be actually what happened. Um, and and so there are a lot of triangulating of sources for me, reading all different types of news coverage and reading the coverage and commentary from different parts of the country was very illuminating. And Mencken, the sage of Baltimore, he just had a poison pen when it came to writing about the South and when it came to writing about the people of Dayton, Tennessee. And he had a huge audience. Nellie Kenyon, much smaller audience. She was a local, a Tennessee reporter, but I bring her, I illuminate her, I spotlight her in the book, in part, in large part, because she was one of only two women. She was really the main woman of, of these hundreds of journalists who were covering the trial. So there was that. And there was also because I found Nellie Kenyon's coverage very even handed. She was really very much just the facts man, unlike Mencken, who was so um, over the top that one Tennessee newspaper who decided that um, they would print his coverage for the duration of the trial prefaced it with a jazz age version of a trigger warning. Like, you people were putting Mencken in the newspaper, but you might be offended by him. And of course, people were offended by him because he said horrible things about the people of Tennessee.
And I think he was spoiling for a fight, just like Darrow was. He had his ideas, and he was going to get them out his way, and the heck with what's
You're
going
right.
on. Yeah,
You
yeah,
are
wow.
right.
Well,
Yes.
now that brings me to another point because you also bring in the black newspapers. The
Yes.
black papers covered this, and their take on things was a little bit different than the white newspapers or the mainstream newspapers, as we would call it. Tell us a little bit about that difference, please.
Some of the most interesting commentary I found about William Jennings Bryan came from the black owned newspapers because they called out his anti-science bias, um, his ignorance, or maybe he was maybe he did understand the science of evolution but didn't like it. But they also called out his blatant racism. I mean, this was a man, William Jennings Bryan, who began his memoir by saying, I was born a member of the greatest of all races, the Caucasian race. Um, and if so, apart from just calling him out on his racism and bigotry, which they had done throughout his career, um, they pointed out things like this, which I wish more people had been able to read. It was in the Chicago Defender. The Chicago Defender pointed out, I'm not going to get the quote verbatim, um, but after the law was passed in earlier in 1925 in Tennessee, the Defender pointed out that all that these Tennessee legislators know about the subject, about evolution, is that the entire race, under the theory of evolution, is supposed to have started from a common ancestor. Therein lies their difficulty. That is, Blaine, there was a white supremacy school of thought in the anti-evolution community, a school of thought that denied, of course, that white and black people could possibly have a common ancestor. And I'm not sure how many white readers would have ever thought of that. I'm also not saying that William Jennings Bryan was part of that school of thought, although he was bigoted. I don't think that is where his anti-evolution stance came from. His anti-evolution stance came from biblical literalism, believing in the 7 days of 24 hours
Right.
story of
Right.
of evolution.
Right. Right. So that very interesting. Very interesting how things are. Now, a little bit about John Scopes. We talked about him in the beginning, but this whole thing with John Scopes, this whole trial in this little town of Tennessee, it was all planned. Tell us about what happened. How did this actually get into the court system?
The town of Dayton was um, was it needed some uplift. Industries that had been there had failed. The town leaders were looking for a way to enliven things, and also and maybe even bring in some new industry that would create jobs. So when they read in the Chattanooga newspaper that the ACL, the American Civil Liberties Union, which was quite new at the time, was hoping to find a teacher willing to stand for a test case. They, the town leaders, not John Scopes, thought, we could bring a lot of attention to our town if we prosecuted our high school biology teacher. So they brought John in to a little meeting at the drugstore on Main Street and asked him if he would do it. And he said yes. Um, he wasn't a pushover. I wouldn't say it's because he was a pushover. He was very young. But he said yes almost immediately. He was I don't even want to say a believer in evolution because I don't think science is something you believe in or not, but he accepted and understood the theory of evolution, had read Darwin's books, but he wasn't an expert. Still, it appealed to him. It appealed to him to, I think, to be able to say yes, and also to be doing something that was consistent with his own stance on science. Not that he spent a lot of time teaching science and teaching evolution in the classroom, but this appealed to him. And the fact that it was a setup made it as unlike an actual criminal trial as it could be. It was a spectacle. It was really a battle between William Jennings Bryan for creationism and Clarence Darrow for science. Scopes was in there, but
In name
um,
only.
it, yeah, in name only, and yet I do think we owe him credit because he could have said no. He didn't say no. So, and it took some bravery. He did get some hate mail. He also got a lot of fan mail, and he really handled the whole thing with equanimity, I would say.
Yeah. It's a fascinating thing how this whole thing was staged. It was set up. We got it here. Now we're going to have this trial. Now, this trial takes place in the courthouse, and the courtroom is on the second floor. There's a lot of concern that the floor is going to buckle and they're going to crash down into the first floor. I mean, it was that well attended. How many people could they get in the courtroom? And I was amazed at the numbers that were there.
Hundreds of people, but not thousands of people. When I felt I was as amazed as you um, about this concern about the floor crashing into the first floor. It was really the judge who was concerned. It's not like some town engineer came to him and said, "Uh-oh, we better leave." He was concerned. I mean, the courtroom had never been that crowded, and so that is why for the very last day, for the big showdown, really between Brian and Darrow, that is how they ended up outside on the courthouse lawn, where they actually did have thousands of spectators because it was outdoors. The whole trial, although the courtroom could only handle so many people, and many of those people were press. Um, but the trial was broadcast throughout the town, so there were loudspeakers outdoors, so that Daytonians could listen, but also WGN Radio of Chicago broadcast the trial. Um, not exactly across the entire country, but certainly back as far away as Chicago and elsewhere. And it was the first trial to be broadcast by radio.
Yeah. And what's interesting is while the whole town could listen outside, there were 12 people who didn't hear anything. And those were the jurors. Now, you want to tell us why, first of all, who was doing the questioning outside and why weren't the jurors there listening to this testimony?
Well, by that last day of so-called testimony, and it was really speechifying, but it's technically testifying. It was Clarence Darrow examining William Jennings Bryan in a really brilliant last-minute move by Darrow. He saw that Scopes was going to be found guilty for reasons that we don't have to get in here, but that are made clear in the book. Um, but like I said, he was really out to take William Jennings Bryan down a peg or two or three. And so he got him on the stand to examine him on his beliefs, on Darrow's beliefs on religion and evolution. And the questions were, they started out, Darrow was brilliant. They started out respectful, you know, here, there. Let's ask you about what do you think about this this tenet of Christianity? Do you know anything about Buddhism? Um, and then it got harsher and harsher, and Darrow's um, explanation for putting Brian on the stand, and of course Brian could have declined, but he didn't. He was all in. Was to show an appeals court, because they knew they were going to go up on appeal, just another type of so-called expert on religion and evolution. Now, Darrow, of course, thought that Brian was a ridiculous expert on evolution and religion, but that is what he wanted to unveil for the appeals court. I don't really know. I think it's more for the country. He just wanted to put Brian's beliefs, which he found ignorant, on display. But you are right. The judge excluded the jury from the goings on inside the courtroom and the goings on outside the courtroom, because the judge defined relevance for this trial very narrowly. And all of the information about what does evolution mean, all of Brian's speechifying, none of it, the judge said, was relevant. And so the poor jury, all the jurors were excluded. They didn't hear anything.
Right. This is basically.
But the country did.
Right. This is basically a fact. And this is where I learned so much. This this quote trial is basically about arguing motions and things like that. And all this going on was outside of the jury. They didn't, judge didn't, you're not going to hear this. I'll rule. And it took days of testimony.
You're right, and of course, it's not lest it sound that it was boring, because when I think of motions practice, I think, motions are making a motion in court and then arguing it sounds boring, but that was just making motions and then arguing them. It was just a way to get into the interesting stuff, really. It was a way for the defense to get in all kinds of information, educating people about what does evolution mean, and then also educating people and, in their view, exposing Brian and his followers' misunderstanding of what evolution meant and what science was, what the scientific method was. And it's all very compelling stuff. Yeah.
It is. But by the end, the jurors had a very simple question to answer. Did John Scopes violate the law by teaching evolution? They didn't get into creationism, didn't get into evolution, didn't get into any of that. Did he do it? Yes or no? And they had some students. Bingo, bango, bongo. The case is over. And Debbie, I was amazed. I'm amazed at that. I don't teach you these things, and so I'm so happy you educated me on this.
Happy to be of service.
Well, now, one of the things that happened shortly after the trial was that Williams Jennings Bryan dies. And do you think this helped increase the myth, the legend of the trial, of the battle that was going on? Do you think that's why it's sort of been changed in our mind as what really happened and now what we think happened?
It is true that in the immediate aftermath, there was a great deal of myth making and even sanctifying of William Jennings Bryan. Uh, but eventually, both sides made their own myths. And so, while sure, in the immediate several years after the trial, yes, it was very much a Bryan story because, well, I'm going to give it away here, but yes, John Scopes is found guilty, and that makes Bryan the winner. And my goodness, he died immediately. But I think in the longer historical arc, I'm not so sure that the Bryan mythology took hold outside of fundamentalist memory, because after all, Darrow is also revered in many quarters for his work as a great trial lawyer, but also for what he did in this trial. And after 1955, which is when the play Inherit the Wind took Broadway by storm, and then it was made into a movie, I think that is a story that shaped historical memory for many in the popular mind.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, I think that's fair. I think that's a fair assessment. But
I
it's
try to be
funny.
fair.
Well, that's the best thing. You know, it's funny because you talked about how back then, 25, 26, people like to show. They like the show. And it reminds me, a couple of weeks ago, I had on another lovely lady who wrote a book called Sister Sinner. It's
I
about
listened to that. I
Amy
listened to
Semple
that
McPherson.
podcast.
Did
That
you
was so
notice?
great.
Yeah, the similarities. They put on a show. They got
Yes,
people excited. They put on a show. Yeah, that was. I kept thinking, my God, look at that. I should have these two women on at the same time. You guys did wonderful jobs explaining that era to us and explaining the whole thing. And again, it was before TV, not much radio. It was
right.
just a different time, and
Yes, yes.
people want to
People
show.
people, swarmed to hear great orators, and Brian was a great one, and so was Darrow. I mean, they were both on the Chautauqua circuit. Brian made tons of money as a speaker, um, and but there is sort of a connection to today. Um, so you know, it is true we have many more forms of entertainment today. We can go to rock concerts. We can listen to podcasts. Um, but I think people still really enjoy joining in cheering contests. I mean, cheering sections and booing sections, and um, that's sort of the. In some ways, I think it's even worse today because if you if you read the book and if you were to like read the trial transcript, there was listening going on. There was an I felt like the judge, who may have made a lot of mistakes and wasn't really fair, but I did see him, read about him, leaning in an earnest effort to learn something about evolution. Um, and and the spectators too. The spectators, I mean, they cheered that guy Dudley Field Malone, even those who were anti evolution. So I felt like they were willing to listen to information that was even unnerving to them. Um, and so there was listening, and I am concerned that at times, anyway, in our media environment, maybe because we have so many choices, and of course, there's political polarization. There was back then too. Social splintering. There was back then too, but they all contribute to this feeling that I have anyway, that a lot of people think the way to debate is to body slam. And that's all part of the show. It's all part of the entertainment. So, yes, to what you're saying about it was a big entertainment back then and interesting for us to see that. And I think we can hold a mirror up to ourselves today and see something very similar, just with a lot more tech, a lot more technology.
One of the things I wanted to ask you, we don't have that much time left. My word, we can talk forever on this. You know that. Uh, One of the things that's fascinating is that each day the judge began the trial with these long prayers being issued by the ministers of Dayton, Tennessee. I was wondering, do you think that influenced anybody? It just got but it got under Darrow's skin, I think.
It did. And, you could write this book and not point out that each day was started with a prayer. But I chose to point it out because um, it tended to create an environment that was pretty hostile to John Scopes's case, pretty hostile to acknowledging the science of evolution. And that's, I mean, it's a trial. There's supposed to be two sides here. And I say this not because they were prayers per se, but rather because they were sometimes, not always, sometimes prayers that asserted the like inerrancy of the biblical story of creation, and that's what was supposed to be in question here. And sometimes also blame the prayers were said in the name of, for example, our blessed Redeemer, Jesus Christ, which, while a perfectly fine prayer in church, seems insensitive to any Jewish people in the courtroom, such as one of John Scopes's leading defense lawyers, Arthur Garfield Hayes. So I chose it because of the insensitivity that I think it showed. And also, it's sort of this is what it was like back then. You can they would read prayers like that in the courtroom. But I do feel I was conscious of and made an effort to write with respect and understanding about, for example, Brian's deeply held religious beliefs and those of others. At the same time, I wanted to make clear that many other deeply religious people, then, just like now, were capable of having an unshaken belief in God and acknowledge the science of evolution. Because the essential conflict, I hope this comes through, is not between evolution and God, it's between evolution and an insistence on that literal belief that we talked about earlier. Um, So I believe I was fair in bringing up religion quite a lot in the
Yeah,
book.
it's a big part of it.
You're right to note it.
The trial is over, everybody leaves. Did it, other than a couple weeks of, income, did anything ever happen to Dayton, Tennessee? Did they ever get business and industry? Anything happen like that?
Well, I'll mention a couple things. First, after Brian died, his supporters founded a university, which is still there, now called Bryan College. At first, it was William Jennings Bryan University. Now it's maybe shrunk a little bit, and it's a college. It's still there. And eventually, but I don't think it was because of the attention drawn to the town from the trial, Lazy Boy went there and manufactures their furniture there. So it's the town's still chugging along.
Good. There you go.
Yeah.
Very
I think
good.
it's probably better than ever. Yes.
Probably better than it was in 1925, I'll tell you that
I
much.
think so. Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, what a wonderful effort. Which brings me to my final question.
Yeah.
What is next for Debbie Levy? Because you did such a great job. I want to know what's the next book I want to read.
Well, I have some other books in the pipeline coming out. Um, so and they are very different from this. One is in March, a poetry book coming out from National Geographic Kids Publishing called Photo Arc 123. And it has the photographs of this great and much more famous than me as a photographer, Joel Sartore. His photos of animals paired with my poems about them. So a few years ago, we had Photo Arc ABC, and we went from A to Z. And this time we're going from 1 to 20. So lots and lots of images and 20 poems about the animals. And then in the summer, I have another picture book coming out, but it's also nonfiction. So nonfiction like A Dangerous Idea. It's called The Friendship Train. And it is about, do you know what the friendship train is?
Not really.
No. Okay. In 1947, someone had the idea of sending a train from the west coast of this country to the east coast to gather up foodstuffs from ordinary Americans to send over to the people of Europe who, 1947, were still very much in post World War II mode. There was starvation. There was an expected very poor harvest for that summer, and the Marshall Plan wasn't yet in place. So it was this private effort, and children played, this is a children's book, of course. Children played a great role in gathering the food and sending lots and lots of good food over to the children and adults, to the people who had just come out of this horrible war. So those are two things that I've got
Good.
coming up
Okay.
this year.
Okay. Good. Good. Well, I certainly hope we see more from you, more from this wonderful history, uncovering these things, little known facts. I'm have to read The Friendship Train. I was unaware of that also. But lots of good stuff coming out from Debbie Levy. Debbie, you have done a wonderful job. I appreciate all your effort and your time. How long did it take you to research this book?
Oh, a long time. I started sometime during the pandemic.
Okay.
Um, uh, I mean, months and months and months.
Yeah.
I mean, the whole process was probably a couple of years,
Yeah.
maybe a little more.
We hear a lot of that from authors, that they couldn't do stuff. So they either did research, or if they were barred from research, they had to stop things until they could get to the research, get to the there and live. But the pandemic plays a big part in a lot of you professional writers, how it affected you. So this helped you do some good research. That's good.
It did. It did. So this event, the pandemic didn't stop me. It sort of made me think, okay, I need a really, really all-encompassing project for the next several months, which turned into a couple of years. And so, yes, yeah, a silver lining. Not much of one, but a silver
Yeah,
lining.
this is a gold lining in this book. That's all I can tell you. Great book.
Thanks.
Debbie Levy,
Thanks.
thank you so much for being with us today on Books and Looks.
Thank you, Blaine. Pleasure to be here.
The Scopes Monkey Trial, friends. Wow. Wow. What an amazing book Debbie has written for us. I think you want to really get this one. A Dangerous Idea. It came out January 14th. You can get it anywhere, online, at libraries. It is a wonderful book about a pretty interesting part of American history. But what am I looking at? And that's what's even more interesting than this, is I'm looking at the movie Inherit the Wind. Have you watched that? That's a fantastic black and white movie about this Scopes monkey trial. And it is dazzling. The performances are spectacular. The only thing I have to say is they got most of it all wrong. That's right. Don't look at that for history because that's not what really happened. But you had some outstanding acting. You got Spencer Tracy as Clarence Darrow. You have Frederick March as William Jennings Bryan. You got Gene Kelly as H.L. Mencken, who I think this is his worst role, really. But you have these wonderful, wonderful actors. Henry Morgan is on as the judge. It is just a wonderful movie which recaptures that era. It's in black and white. It shows the evolution versus the creationism. It is wonderful. Like I said, historically, it's all wrong. But I don't watch a movie for historical accuracy. I want to be entertained, and I'm going to tell you what, Inherit the Wind is a spectacular play and then movie. Give it a watch, okay? That's what I'm looking at. So anyway, on behalf of my good friends at Podcast Studio X, this is Blaine DeSantis for Books and Looks, saying may all your leaves be pages in a book.